The iron shackles bit into my wrists as the ship lurched beneath my feet, and I watched Marcus count the gold coins one more time, his merchant smile never reaching his eyes. 20,000 pieces of silver. That's what I was worth to him, less than the cost of one of his smaller trading vessels. A pleasure doing business with you, Captain Rodrigo, Marcus said, shaking hands with the grizzled pirate who'd just purchased me like a crate of silk. She's healthy, well-educated, and should fetch an excellent price in the eastern markets. I didn't scream, I didn't beg. I simply memorized every detail of Marcus's face as he turned away, already calculating his profits. He didn't know, couldn't possibly know, that this was the second time I'd lived this moment. In my first life, I'd died here. Thrown overboard during a storm 3 weeks later, my body swallowed by the indifferent sea. I'd been too broken, too trusting, too naive to understand what was happening until it was far too late. I'd believed Marcus loved me, believed our engagement meant something, believed the lies he whispered about debts and temporary measures and coming back for me. But the universe, in its infinite cruelty or mercy, had given me a second chance. I'd woken up 6 months earlier, gasping in my bed, back in my father's house with all my memories intact. Memories of betrayal, of Marcus's cold calculation, of the way he'd quietly sold off my mother's jewelry piece by piece while telling me he was investing in our future. Memories of how his shipping empire was built on my father's connections and my dowry, and how he'd planned to dispose of me the moment I'd served my purpose. This time, I'd come prepared. "Wait!" I called out as the pirates began to drag me below deck. My voice was steady, controlled. "Captain Rodrigo, I presume you're heading to the Ivory Coast?" The captain paused, his weathered face creasing with surprise. Ladies in silk dresses didn't typically know pirate routes. "What's it to you, girl?" "Because in 3 days, the merchant vessel Golden Promise will pass through the Serpent Strait carrying a cargo worth 3 times what you just paid for me. Unguarded, undermanned, and completely unaware that their route was leaked to the Royal Navy." I smiled, cold and calculating. Unless, of course, someone warned them, or better yet, took it first. Rodrigo's eyes narrowed. "How would a merchant's bride know such things?" "Because my dear fiancé is the one who leaked the route. He's been trading information to the Navy for reduced tariffs while double booking his manifest to cover the losses." I rattled off the ship's tonnage, its captain's name, and the exact coordinates where it would be most vulnerable. "I spent 6 months in his office learning his business. He thought I was just organizing his papers." The first life, I'd been blind to it all. This life, I'd memorized every ledger, every secret deal, every corrupt practice. I'd become a ghost in Marcus's office, a pretty decoration who absorbed every piece of information like a sponge. Captain Rodrigo studied me for a long moment, then barked out a laugh. "Interesting cargo I've acquired." "Very well, girl. If you're lying, you'll be feeding the sharks. If you're telling the truth—" He leaned closer, his breath reeking of rum and tobacco. "Then maybe you're worth keeping around." The Golden Promise went down exactly where I said it would, its cargo of spices and silver, filling Rodrigo's hold while Marcus's business partner bled out on the deck, still clutching the forged Navy documents that would have let him sail through unmolested. I watched from the rigging, my shackles now removed, a cutlass belted at my waist. That was the first ship. It wouldn't be the last. My life before the betrayal had been a carefully constructed cage of silk and propriety. My father, Edmund Ashworth, had built a modest shipping business on integrity and hard work, enough to provide for our family, but never enough to satisfy my stepmother's aspirations. When he died of fever during my 19th year, she'd wasted no time. "You'll marry Marcus Blackwood," she'd announced at the funeral, before my father was even cold in the ground. "He's agreed to take on your father's debts and absorb the business. It's generous of him, considering." Considering what? That I was damaged goods? That my father's company was worth more than I was? I'd bitten back every question, played the dutiful daughter, because I'd been raised to believe that was what good women did. Marcus had courted me with calculated precision, flowers on schedule, compliments that felt rehearsed, a proposal that came with contracts, so many contracts, that I'd been too overwhelmed and grieving to read properly. I'd signed away my inheritance, my father's ships, my mother's estate, everything. In my first life, I'd discovered the truth too late. I'd found the ledgers 6 months into our engagement, hidden in his study, seen how he'd systematically stripped my father's business, sold off the profitable routes, and kept only the ships he could use for his illegal smuggling operations. I'd confronted him, and he'd smiled that same cold smile. "You're too smart for your own good, Eleanor," he'd said. "I'm afraid I can't have a wife who asks questions." 3 days later, I was on Rodrigo's ship, sold to cover debts that didn't exist. In that life, I'd been too shocked to function, too broken to fight. I'd let them take me below decks where I'd huddled in the darkness, waiting for salvation that never came. But this life was different. This life I'd spent 6 months preparing. I'd seduced no one and confronted nothing. Instead, I'd played the perfect, vapid bride-to-be. I'd giggled over fabrics and flowers while memorizing Marcus's shipping schedules. I'd asked silly questions about his business while cataloging every corrupt official in his pocket, every smuggling route, every weakness. I'd copied ledgers in the middle of the night and hidden them where he'd never think to look, inside the hollow heels of my dancing shoes. And when the day came that he sold me, I'd gone willingly because I knew exactly what I was doing. Captain Rodrigo's crew didn't trust me at first. I was a woman, a former lady, and far too clean to belong on a pirate vessel. But I had something they needed, information. And I had something they didn't expect, ruthlessness. "The Silver Dawn will be in port for 3 days," I told Rodrigo over charts in his cabin. We'd been at sea for 2 weeks, and I'd proven my worth twice over. Marcus keeps his personal fortune in the captain's quarters. He doesn't trust banks. 40,000 in gold and jewels. "And how do we get past the port guards?" asked Santiago, Rodrigo's first mate, a scar-faced Spaniard who'd made no secret of his distaste for me. I smiled. "We don't. We wait until the Silver Dawn leaves port, then we take her at sea. The crew is loyal to Marcus, but they're not warriors. They'll surrender if we promise them shares and freedom. And if they don't, then they sink with the ship." My voice was ice. "I won't mourn men who profited from my father's murder." Santiago's eyebrows rose. "Murder?" "Marcus poisoned him. Slowly, carefully, over months. Made it look like fever. I found the arsenic bottles in his study, labeled as tonic." I met his gaze without flinching. "My father died in agony while Marcus held my hand and comforted me, already planning how to steal everything he'd built." The room fell silent. Even these hardened pirates understood the violation of that kind of betrayal. "Why didn't you go to the authorities?" Rodrigo asked. "Because the magistrate is in Marcus's pocket. The governor, too. I had no proof they'd accept, no allies who'd believe a grieving girl over a respected merchant. I leaned over the charts. So I'll build my own justice." The Silver Dawn went down fighting, but not well. Half the crew surrendered as I'd predicted, their loyalty to Marcus proving shallow when faced with actual danger. We stripped the ship of everything valuable, including the detailed ledgers I knew Marcus kept in his quarters. More evidence of his crimes, more information about his operations. And then I gave the order to sink her. I stood at the railing, watching Marcus's flagship slip beneath the waves, and felt nothing but cold satisfaction. 1 ship down, 15 more to go. I learned to sail in those first months. Not the delicate, decorative sailing that ladies sometimes did for amusement, but real sailing. How to read the wind and stars, how to navigate by dead reckoning, how to predict storms. I learned to fight too, though I'd never be as strong as the men. Santiago taught me to use speed and surprise, to go for vulnerable spots, to be ruthless. "You're a natural," he admitted grudgingly after I'd disarmed him for the first time. "But you fight angry, that'll get you killed." "I am angry," I replied, wiping sweat from my face, "and I'll stay angry until this is finished." But he was right. I needed to be cold, not hot, calculated, not emotional. So I studied the pirates, learned their ways, understood how they thought. I memorized every sea route between here and the eastern markets, every pirate haven, every corrupt official who might be turned or blackmailed. And I began to build my own network. The first maid I recruited was a woman named Isabella, found in chains in a slave market in Tortuga. She'd been a naval officer before being framed for a crime she didn't commit, another victim of Marcus's schemes, as it turned out. He'd bribed officials to accuse her of smuggling when she'd gotten too close to his operations. "Help me sink him," I'd said, buying her freedom with gold from the Silver Dawn. "And I'll give you proof to clear your name." She'd agreed without hesitation. The second was a navigator named Chen Wei, whose family's merchant business had been destroyed by Marcus's predatory practices. The third was a disgraced nobleman named Thomas, whose sister had been one of Marcus's disappeared fiancés before me, sold into slavery just as I'd been, though she hadn't survived the voyage. One by one, I collected the people Marcus had destroyed, and I turned them into weapons. Captain Rodrigo watched this transformation with wary respect. "You're building something," he observed one night, sharing rum in his cabin. "Something bigger than revenge." "I'm building an empire," I corrected. "Marcus's empire built on blood and betrayal. I'm going to tear it down piece by piece, and then I'm going to rebuild it properly. No slaves, no corruption, fair trade, and honest profit." I took a sip of rum, barely flinching at the burn. "And when I'm done, Marcus will have nothing. Not his ships, not his fortune, not his reputation. Nothing." "That's not revenge," Rodrigo said softly. "That's war." "Good," I smiled. "Then let's make sure I win." The turning point came 6 months after my sail. Captain Rodrigo fell ill, bad fish, the ship's doctor claimed, though I suspected poison from a rival crew. He lasted 3 fever-racked days before calling me to his quarters. "The crew respects you," he rasped, his face gray. "You've made us richer than we've been in years. You've made us smarter." He coughed, blood flecking his lips. "Santiago wants the captaincy, but he's too hot-headed. Thomas is too cautious. Isabella's too angry." "And me?" I asked, though I already knew. "You're all 3 and none of them." He pressed his seal ring into my palm, the symbol of his authority. "You're cold when you need to be, careful when it counts, and angry enough to never give up. Take the ship, Eleanor, take the whole damned fleet." He died that night, and I stood before the crew at dawn with his ring on my finger and his cutlass at my hip. "I'm not asking for your loyalty," I told it. Them, my voice carrying across the deck. "I'm buying it. Follow me and you'll be richer than you ever dreamed. Betray me and you'll feed the sharks. I don't care about your past or your crimes. I care about results." Santiago stepped forward, hand on his sword. "The captain is chosen by vote, not appointed by a dying man." "Then call the vote," I said calmly. "But know this, I have information on every ship in Marcus Blackwood's fleet. I know their routes, their defenses, their weaknesses. I can make you all wealthy beyond measure. Or," I let the silence stretch, "I can take my knowledge and find a crew that wants it." The vote was unanimous. Even Santiago, after a long measuring look, raised his hand in approval. I was 20 years old and I was a pirate captain. The war against Marcus began in earnest then. I'd been picking off his ships one by one, but now I had the resources to truly hurt him. 3 ships under my command, with more joining every month as word spread of the mysterious new captain who never lost and paid her crews in gold, not promises. I attacked his operations systematically, strategically. Not just his ships, but his warehouses, his supply lines, his corrupt officials. I bribed better, threatened smarter, and moved faster than he could counter. Every ship I took, I either claimed for my own fleet or sold at prices that undercut his market rates. Every cargo I seized, I distributed through channels that had nothing to do with his network. I was dismantling his empire the same way he'd built it, through ruthless efficiency and complete disregard for traditional rules. But I hadn't forgotten the personal touch. 8 months into my captaincy, I arranged for a letter to reach Marcus. It was delivered by one of his own captains, a man I'd captured, broken, and turned, placed on his desk in his private office where he counted his diminishing gold. "Dear Marcus, do you remember what you paid for me? 20,000 pieces of silver. I've cost you 300,000 so far, and I'm just getting started. You should have killed me when you had the chance. Your loving fiancé, Captain Eleanor Ashworth." I heard later that he'd raged for hours, smashing furniture and threatening everyone in reach. Good. I wanted him afraid. I wanted him to feel a fraction of the terror I'd felt in my first life, helpless and alone. But fear wasn't enough. I wanted ruin. The climax came in the spring, 14 months after my rebirth. I'd whittled Marcus's fleet from 16 ships to 7, his fortune from millions to thousands, his reputation from respected merchant to suspected criminal. The authorities were finally investigating him, helped by anonymous tips and carefully leaked documents that proved his smuggling operations, his bribes, his murders. But I wanted to face him myself. I wanted him to know exactly who'd destroyed him. I sent word through the underworld that Captain Eleanor Ashworth requested a parley, neutral waters, 3 ships each, a negotiation for the future of maritime trade in the region. Marcus was desperate enough by then to agree, hoping perhaps to assassinate me or turn my crew against me with promises of riches. He didn't understand that my crew's loyalty couldn't be bought. It had been earned through shared profit and mutual respect, concepts utterly foreign to him. We met at dawn on glass-calm seas, our ships arranged in a careful triangle. I stood at the prow of my flagship, formerly the Golden Promise, now renamed Ashworth's Revenge, dressed not in silk but in leather and steel, my hair bound back, my father's pocket watch hanging at my neck. Marcus stood on the deck of his last remaining valuable ship, the Merchant's Pride, and even from a distance I could see how he'd aged. Gray streaked his hair now, and the confident swagger was gone, replaced by a desperate tension. "Eleanor," he called across the water, "I should have known, I should have seen it." "You were too busy counting your gold," I called back, too arrogant to imagine that the silly girl signing papers might be paying attention. "What do you want? Money? Ships? I'll give you half of everything I have left. We can rebuild together." I laughed, cold and sharp. "I don't want half of your scraps, Marcus. I want everything. Your ships, your fortune, your freedom. I want you to feel what my father felt when you poisoned him. What I felt when you sold me like cargo." "That was business." His voice rose, cracking. "Your father was dying anyway. I just accelerated the process. And you were supposed to be sold in the Eastern markets, live a comfortable life as some merchant's wife. I was even going to get a commission. You sold me to pirates and planned to collect a finder's fee when I was resold." The flatness in my voice made several of my crew members shift uncomfortably. "You are a monster, Marcus, and today your business ends." I'd signaled before the words even left my mouth. Isabella on my port side, Chenway on my starboard, and 2 more ships emerging from the morning mist behind Marcus's position. He was surrounded, outgunned, and out of options. "You can surrender," I continued, "transfer ownership of your remaining assets and spend the rest of your life in prison for your crimes, or you can fight, and I'll sink you where you stand." Marcus's face went through the several expressions: shock, rage, calculation, and finally, despair. He knew he'd lost. Every man on his ship knew it too. "The authorities will never accept this," he tried. "They'll call you a pirate, hunt you down." "The authorities have signed letters of marque waiting in my cabin. I've been working for them for the last 6 months, eliminating smuggling operations and corrupt merchants." I smiled at his expression. "Who do you think they'll believe? The respected merchant who's actually a murderer and slaver, or the privateer who's been cleaning up their problems while providing them with detailed evidence of crimes?" I'd played the long game, just as he had, but I'd played it better. The Merchant's Pride surrendered without firing a shot. Marcus's crew had no loyalty left to give him. I'd offered them amnesty and employment, while Marcus had been beating them and cutting their pay to preserve his failing fortune. They bound him in chains and brought him to my ship, throwing him at my feet on the deck. I looked down at the man who'd destroyed my family, who'd murdered my father, who'd tried to sell me into slavery. In my first life, he'd won. In this life, he knelt before me in chains, while my fleet surrounded his last ships and the morning sun crowned me in gold. "I loved you," he said suddenly, desperately. "In my way, I did. You were intelligent, beautiful. I thought we'd make a good match." "You don't know what love is," I replied. "Love doesn't poison. It doesn't betray. It doesn't sell. I crouched down to his level, wanting him to see my eyes clearly. My father loved me. He built his business honestly so I'd have a future. You murdered him and stole that future. There is no coming back from that, Marcus. There is no redemption. I stood, signaling to my crew. Take him below. The Royal Navy will collect him when we reach port. The charges are murder, smuggling, slavery, bribery of officials, and fraud. The evidence is documented in 3 separate locations and with 4 different authorities. He'll hang. As they dragged him away, Marcus started to scream. Not please, but rage, pure and impotent. The sound of a man who'd finally realized he'd been outplayed at his own game. I felt nothing but satisfaction. The epilogue of my revenge played out over the next 6 months, each scene more perfect than the last. Marcus's trial was spectacular. I attended in a fine dress, looking every inch the respectable merchant's daughter I'd once been, and testified calmly about his crimes. The evidence was overwhelming: ledgers, witnesses, testimony from dozens of people he'd wronged. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. He hanged on a gray Tuesday morning. I watched from a respectful distance, my father's pocket watch in my hand. When it was over, I whispered, "Rest now, Father. Justice is served." The remains of Marcus's business empire I divided strategically. His ships became part of my fleet, which now operated under legitimate letters of marque as privateers and merchant vessels. His warehouses I sold to honest traders, ensuring the profits went to repaying the families he'd destroyed. His personal fortune, what little remained after legal fees and restitution, I donated to establish a maritime orphanage, naming it after my father. My stepmother, who'd pushed me into the engagement, I dealt with more personally. I bought my father's house out from under her, evicted her with nothing but the clothes on her back, and installed Thomas's sister's children in it, orphans who deserved a home. She fled the city in disgrace, and I never saw her again. I didn't need to. She was already erased. As for me, I continued sailing. Captain Eleanor Ashworth became a legend in maritime circles. The woman who'd turned from victim to victor, who commanded a fleet of 7 ships and had the respect of pirates and merchants alike. I married no one, needed no one's permission, answered to no authority except the wind and tide. I split my time between the sea and the counting house, building my father's business back up the right way. Fair wages for my crews, honest manifests, legitimate cargo. I refused to traffic in slaves or smuggled goods, and my reputation became so solid that other merchants sought my protection against pirates, never knowing that I'd once been a pirate myself. Isabella became my first mate and closest friend, her name eventually cleared by the evidence we'd gathered against Marcus. Chen Wei proved himself the finest navigator in the Caribbean, and together we charted routes that cut weeks off traditional passages. Thomas used his nobleman's connections to legitimize our operation fully, becoming my business partner on land while I ruled the sea. We were pirates turned merchants, criminals turned heroes, victims turned victors. And we were wealthy beyond measure, not from theft, but from skill and hard work. 5 years after my rebirth, I stood on the deck of Ashworth's Revenge in the waters where Marcus had sold me. The crew was different now. Most of Rodrigo's original pirates had taken their gold and retired to peaceful lives. The ship itself had been refitted, improved, made faster and more beautiful, but I was still the captain, and I was still sailing. "Where to next, Captain?" Santiago asked. He'd stayed with me through everything, his initial distrust turning to fierce loyalty. I looked out at the horizon, at the endless blue possibility of the ocean. In my first life, I died in these waters, helpless and afraid. In this life, I owned them. "Anywhere we want," I replied, smiling. "The whole world is ours." Behind me, my fleet flew flags bearing my father's crest, a phoenix rising from waves. It was perfect symbolism for what I'd become. Risen from death, reborn from betrayal, triumphant over every obstacle. Marcus Blackwood had sold me for 20,000 pieces of silver, thinking he was disposing of a problem. Instead, he'd created his own destruction. I'd cost him his fortune, his reputation, his freedom, and ultimately his life. I'd dismantled everything he'd built and created something better in its place. And every night, when I looked up at the stars from my captain's quarters, I slept soundly, knowing that justice, real, complete, perfect justice, had been served. The girl who'd signed away her inheritance with trembling hands was gone. In her place was Captain Eleanor Ashworth, merchant queen and pirate legend, wealthy and powerful and utterly free. And I'd never been happier. Some nights when the sea was calm and my crew was settled, I'd take out my father's pocket watch and remember. Remember who I'd been, what I'd lost, how close I'd come to losing everything forever. The universe had given me a second chance, and I'd seized it with both hands, turning tragedy into triumph. Marcus's greatest mistake wasn't murdering my father or selling me to pirates. His greatest mistake was underestimating me, thinking that because I was young and female and grieving, I would be easy to break. He'd broken me once, but he'd never get a second chance. I'd made sure of that. The wind filled my sails, and Ashworth's revenge cut through the waves like a blade through silk. My fleet followed in perfect formation, 7 ships strong and growing every season. We were legitimate, legal, and unstoppable, a maritime empire built on integrity instead of corruption. Everything Marcus had tried to take from me, I'd reclaimed tenfold. Everything he'd built on lies and blood, I destroyed and rebuilt properly. And every day I sailed these waters, I won again. The story of Eleanor Ashworth would be told in port taverns and merchant houses for generations to come. Some would call it a tale of revenge. Others would call it justice. A few wise souls would recognize it for what it truly was, a resurrection. I'd died in those dark waters once, scared and alone. But I'd come back, and I'd come back stronger. I'd turned my betrayal into my greatest advantage, my victimhood into my victory, my death into my legend. And Marcus Blackwood, who'd tried to destroy me, had instead created the instrument of his own annihilation. That was the sweetest revenge of all. As the sun set over the Caribbean, painting the waves in crimson and gold, I raised my father's pocket watch to the dying light and smiled. Wherever he was, I hoped he was proud. I'd taken everything he'd built honestly and made it greater. I'd avenged his murder and honored his memory, and I'd lived, truly lived, in ways I never could have imagined in that first stolen life. "Captain," Isabella called from the helm, "storms brewing to the north. Should we seek shelter?" I looked at the darkening clouds and laughed. I'd faced worse than storms. I'd faced betrayal, slavery, death itself, and emerged victorious. What was a little bad weather? "No," I called back. "We sail through. We're not afraid of storms anymore." We'd become the storm, and God help anyone who got in our way.